to ask for permission. And let me check. Gijs or Daniel, can one of you actually let people in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Because otherwise I'm talking and clicking admit all the time. Okay, welcome everyone. This is a grounded webinar on regenerative agriculture specifically for smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. We have been working with smallholder farmers for about 8 or 9 years now, and we're keen to share some of our insights. The webinar is built up in a couple of steps. So first, we'll share something general about Grounded and our mission. Then Daniel is actually going to take us through some of the regenerative agriculture work we did and some of the results we have seen on soil health, for instance. And then Gijs, one of our colleagues, is going to talk about the financial impact for smallholders and also whether and how this is a scalable or investable model. So Daniel, if you can go to the next slide, or Gijs, Gijs has the slides. Yeah. So to start off with a quote from Roosevelt: "A nation that destroys soil destroys itself." As Grounded, our mission is really to build up soil life, and we do that by working literally from the ground up. So we work a lot directly with farmers in sub-Saharan Africa to see how we can restore soil, because we believe if we can restore soils, we can also restore life on the soil. We can restore farms, make farms thrive, and then make farmers thrive as well. So if you can go to the next slide. Our mission is to scale regenerative agriculture in Africa, to increase biodiversity, improve water retention, restore soil life, and also combat climate change. So agriculture today, as many of you will know, contributes to about 24% of CO2 emissions. And it is actually possible to let agriculture be a positive force for change. You can actually absorb CO2. It can also lead to increased water retention. You can increase biodiversity and soil life. We will all talk about that in this webinar. I'm not going to go into detail because Daniel will cover a lot of this later on. Our question at Grounded has really been, how can you implement this model of regenerative agriculture, which is very promising for farmers like the lady in this picture, who farm on half a hectare of land and have no ability to invest. And so what we have been doing over the past 8 years is searching for a model which is scalable and investable and delivers fair returns for these farmers, but also for nature and for investors. And Gijs, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we have actually found such a model. And the key elements of our model are, first of all, to actually invest in the entire value chain. So not to stop at interventions focusing on a farm level, but to actually look at the entire system in which the farmer operates and see where you can intervene to make these changes possible for the farm and also make them work economically. We'll talk about this later. Also, obviously, everything needs to be underpinned by a very strong business case for farmers, because if there is no business case, it's just impossible for these farmers to implement regenerative agriculture. And especially for this group of farmers, the business case needs to be pretty strong from day one. We cannot let them invest huge amounts of money because that's typically not available. And then lastly, what we have seen over the course of our work is that regenerative agriculture can actually be a very powerful tool for innovation. And it's actually something which is very attainable for smallholder farmers to practice. Grounded is an organization that has been around for, like I said, about 8 years. We have teams in Amsterdam, Nairobi, and Cape Town, South Africa. And Daniel is actually somewhere else in South Africa, and he's currently in Zambia. We operate and invest in numerous companies also in South Africa, Zambia, Tanzania, and Uganda currently. Yeah, that's it. And I'm gonna give the word to Daniel. And Daniel, maybe you should first actually, Daniel's a regenerative agriculture specialist at Grounded. He works with many of the farmers and companies in our portfolio to actually introduce these transitions. And he's currently in Zambia on a farm that we run there where it's 38 degrees. So bear with him, and we hope his laptop is not gonna burst because of the heat. So Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tekla. It's very nice to be talking to everyone today. As Tekla said, I'm here in the southern province of Zambia, just outside of Livingstone. Zambia is currently experiencing the worst drought that it has in the last 60 years. So it's as far back as recorded history. And the result of that is that the smallholder farmers are the ones suffering the most. Most of them had work on rain-fed agriculture, so they'll plant maize as well as some other rain-fed crop. And unfortunately, the rains December, January weren't as good as what they were supposed to be, and so there's been huge losses for these farmers. So I think they've declared a state of disaster for 4 million farmers in Zambia, across 4 million hectares, I think it was. And this, unfortunately, is becoming more and more of a prevalent reality for farmers in Africa with the changing climate. So today, I'm going to touch briefly on what the typical, or who the typical smallholder farmer is that Grounded works with. Typical is used very lightly here. There are an estimated 33 million smallholder farmers in Africa. So to say one of them is typical is a gross understatement. But just to give you an idea of the types of farmers we work with, as well as then the regenerative practices and the results that we've been having with these, implementing these regenerative practices with the farmers. And then lastly, Case will join and share a little bit about how the adoption of these practices, as well as the broader Grounded model, is affecting these farmers financially. Case, you can maybe pass to the next slide, please. 2 weeks ago, I was up in Uganda, northwestern Uganda, and I met this lovely lady called Esther. Esther is a coffee farmer. She's supplying one of our operating companies called Zombo, Zombo Coffee Partners in Nebi district. And Esther farms a half-acre plot of coffee, beautiful mixed agroforestry system under these ancient mountain figs. And we did an estimate with her. She's looking to take off about 500 kilograms of fresh cherries this year. And the total income that she would expect to earn from this, so for her whole season, is just shy of 300 euros. That's her annual income. It represents about 50% of her farming income. She also does cassava, bananas, and then dried bean, partially for own food security, and then she's also selling the bananas and the cassava. The reality is that most of the farmers that Grounded works with operate like this. They'll have a single cash crop for external sales, so something that they don't use themselves or can't really use themselves, that they sell to someone like Zombo Coffee Partners. And then they'll have several different food crops that they rely on as a basic food security, and then any excess they would sell on. Typically, they range from a half an acre like Esther, which is on the small side, to about 3.5 to 4 hectares, some of the farmers that we work with in Zambia. So it really does depend on regions. It depends a lot on climate, on their climates and their growing conditions. One thing that is quite common across these farmers is that very few of them actually use any external inputs. We usually say they organic by default because they just don't have the money to buy expensive chemical inputs. Most of the input cost is labor related, but they also yield very low. So typically they'll yield between 20 and 25% of a commercial farmer yield. Case, you can move on, please. So between the 4 operating companies that Tekla had mentioned, we work with approximately 9,000 smallholder farmers. So work with is maybe a strong word. We across those companies, we source products from these 9,000 farmers. So as Tekla mentioned, across Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, and South Africa. Now, regenerative agriculture, it has many definitions and many different ways to interpret it. We see it as a system of farming practices and principles that enhance the entire ecosystem of the farm. So Gijs, you can pass to the next slide. Smallholder farmers, they also agroecologists by default. Because they can't rely on a single crop, they have to diversify their harvest because they're not always sure that they can sell that single core crop. So often they'll have multiple small patches of land where they're farming with multiple different food crops, and then usually a little bit of livestock integration. Some sheep, some chicken, sheep, or cattle, usually smaller stock. The pastoralists, the cattle herders, are usually in different areas, and they focus exclusively on cattle herding as an activity on more marginal dry land. The problems that the smallholder farmers have currently is that a lot of them are depleting the fertility in their soil. So you'll have often heard of slash and burn agriculture, where if there's enough land available, farmers will come in, they'll clear a new piece of virgin land, they'll farm it for a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, and then after that, they'll have depleted any natural reserves of nutrients in that soil, fertility. And like I said, often they don't have the means to buy in chemical fertilizers to replace those nutrients that they're removing. Tillage is unfortunately a problem. I've never met a farmer that doesn't like the look of freshly turned soil, unfortunately. And so no-till is a difficult concept. And if you're farming in these hills in Uganda, then soil erosion becomes a giant problem. They're damaging soil microbiology, burning out carbon. And all of this is resulting in a rapid depletion of soil organic matter. The thing is, though, that regenerative practices are almost ideally suited to addressing the challenges that these smallholder farmers have. And like I said, they already have a fairly diverse agro-ecosystem going, so they just need to tweak it very slightly to be able to adopt to these regen practices. Okay, so you can move to the next slide. So we have several different regen support programs. Each of our operating companies has its own what we call a regen support program, an outreach program for the farmers we work with. Here you can see second from right is Michelle with a white t-shirt, and next to her is Umari. Michelle is based in Kenya. She's a soil scientist, and Umari is a field agronomist based in Tanzania. And they are busy helping farmers produce disease suppressive compost in Tanzania, in the East Usambara Mountains, that's specifically focused on treating pepper vines for Phytophthora root rot. So we have multiple different techniques and tools that are appropriate, and we use field agents and a high level of active support to train the farmers we work with to implement these techniques. Okay, so you can move to the next slide. So here you can see Esther in the middle of the picture over there. Typically, if I go into a new landscape and a new operating company, I'll work with Esther and her peers and try and identify the real world challenges that these farmers have. Often, people do desktop exercises and they guess what's going to go wrong in the landscape, but we try and take a ground up approach. From there, we'll develop a regen roadmap. So this is essentially a holistic plan that tries to identify the lowest hanging fruit, the most easy interventions that we believe the farmers can take on, taking into consideration how much money they have to invest into their farms, how much time, labor, what kinds of other resources they might have available. Then we'll usually develop and implement a training program. These are predominantly focused around something like organic certification training programs that we then start to introduce some of these regen practices. If we find there's a good case for it, we may do an input subsidy, but we do this very sparingly, and we do this where it might be introducing a new cover crop and bringing a little bit of seed so that the farmers can grow it themselves and save that seed for the next generation. So it's not, we try and avoid any long-term input subsidies, but rather use input subsidy to introduce a new material or a new resource that the farmers can take on and propagate themselves. We'll then identify lead farmers and model farmers from these training programs, so that the eager early adopters, and then with usually a team of field agronomists, we'll nurture these lead farmers so that they become very strong examples for the farmers that are surrounding them. And then there's the last step is that we provide an offtake. So Gijs will touch on this in much more detail, but we'll provide an offtake, and then we'll monitor the success of these farmers, and then the loop becomes self-reinforcing. On the next slide, Gijs. Just in terms of practical regen practices, obviously we can't train farmers to go on and buy a no-till plant or something like that. It's not within the capacity of the farmers we work with, but we can teach them how to produce compost and save manures, how to produce bioliquid fertilizers, biopesticides. We have a strong emphasis on cover crops and intercropping, especially for green manures, and then we try and help them refine their diversity of crops. So to help look at what other crops, what companion crops would be useful, what other food crops can work in the system, and to try and increase the diversity. And then where possible, to try and also convince them to bring in more livestock into their systems. So you may, the next slide, please, Faith. We are very lucky here in Zambia. The IFC farm, it stands for Incubator Farm Company, is a fully grounded run operation, obviously with a local team. And here we've got the freedom to do a lot of R&D. So we've been doing some pretty extreme regen practices here, looking at a lot of cover crop, composting, manuring, developing our own biopesticides. And we do this all from the context of a smallholder farmer. We've seen over the last 3 years of operations here, we've seen approximately 250% increase in soil organic matter in some cases. So very rapid increases in soil organic matter. We've managed to take the crops where we started. It has been a tough transition. So the first 2 years were very difficult, but this year the crops are performing on par with conventional crops on a profitability basis. So they might not yield as high as conventional crops, but the lower cost because of the regen inputs and decent yields means that we're as profitable as any kind of conventional crop for our region. So conventional farmers, and this is a big thing in the West, are struggling with this transition to regenerative agriculture. There's often a very high transition cost. You need to buy a new implement. You need to, throw away your plow. All of these old sayings. Probably have to bring in more animals. That means fencing your land. It means training more people. So there's often a very high cost to transition. there's usually a lack of knowledge. So it is very new, and a lot of the knowledge is classically trained agronomists who are usually working for a fertilizer company. So you now need to find some crazy consultant who can talk to you about regen practices. There's a lot of financial risk. I know a lot of South African farmers who can't transition because they work on a debt financing basis. So they can't get a production loan from the co-op or from the banks because of this, because they want to try a different system. There's just too much risk for the banks, so they don't finance this. It's often social pressure. The farmers around you don't want you to transition, and then there are unclear outcomes. Regen doesn't work. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't always work perfectly. And the farmers that we hear about in the West who are having this huge amount of success is after 30 years of really intensive R&D, trial and error. So it's very difficult to convince a farmer to transition in 1 year based on a track record like that. So you can pass to the next slide. The thing is, for a small scale farmer, everything that's against a large scale commercial farmer transitioning to regen is actually in favor of a small scale farmer. As I mentioned, often they have diverse farming systems with multiple crops, with diversity with animals and perennials in the system already. There's often a very quick increase in yield and quality because they're not doing very much in terms of inputs. As soon as they do start manuring or composting or going low tillage, there's almost an immediate boost in yield and quality. The techniques that we give to the farmers require very little in terms of equipment or specialized inputs. So there's usually a very low transition cost for the farmers. And the farmers are very well connected to their land. So if you are farming a half a hectare of land, you can very quickly see if things are working or not working. There's an immediate feedback loop. And one of the biggest success factor for these farmers is knowledge. So if they have the knowledge is one of these wonderful things. If I've got an idea and I give you an idea, then we both have that idea. If I have $1 and I give you $1, you've got $1 and I don't have $1. So knowledge is one of these things that's self-perpetuating, and it's the farmers can then share that knowledge with the other farmers in their regions. And all of this means that you can very rapidly adopt regen practices among small-scale farmers. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Gijs to talk a little bit about the economic ecosystems that we are also developing from Grounded side.
I'm just gonna quickly jump in to say that if you have questions, you can maybe type them in the chat and we can see if we can address them at the end. Sorry, I forgot to say that in the beginning. We don't host webinars on a daily basis, so bear with us. Gijs.
No, thanks, Daniel. I want to take it back to one of the most important other lessons that we've learned as Grounded the hard way over the past 8-9 years, is that even though it took us a long time to become better at regenerative agriculture and learn about that transition, what steps to take and what a roadmap looks like, is also for us to understand how does it work economically. And one of the most important things that we've learned is that everything which we do needs to be embedded in a strong economic rationale. And any area, any crop that you plant in a specific area, you need to understand how is this area competing to other areas. If you have a local crop, to other local producers. If you have a regional crop, how does this perform in the region? What are your advantages in the region? What time of year do you produce compared to other players? And internationally, what benefits do you have compared to other producers? In Tanzania, where we invested and support a spice business, Trianon, there are a lot of organic spices, and EU is tightening regulations. And that is something to keep in mind, because you see that a lot of the buyers in Europe are desperately looking for other origins, partly due to climate change, partly due to regulations. And Tanzania holds a lot of organic supply, but is not yet able to meet that supply in Europe. but it does mean that if you're able to meet that supply and to get to the criteria that the EU is asking, there's an opportunity to compete with other origins. And that is something that for Grounded is critical. You need to be able to, you need to understand for each of the areas how you compete into other value chains. And if you do that well, and you have something to offer, you can create a market-based system and create market-based incentives for farmers to deliver on those targets. And I think that's how we've distinguished ourselves from most of the programs and operations that are going on that are input-based and yield increasing based. We come from a market point of view. And to capture premium prices, it is important not just to work with the farmers on the best quality, but especially in Africa, there's a severe lack of processing equipment, processing factories, places where you can do it that are food safe, and teams that have experience with international standards. And that is what Grounded invests in secondly. So what Daniel explained is one half of the investment. The other half of the investment is into these companies, aggregators, and bridging between farmers and international markets. Now, the business case, that's actually where it's interesting. The business case of these agri-processing companies and aggregators that we invest in is that if we invest, these companies make a small margin. They typically bootstrapped companies. There's a lot of these companies in Africa that supply to local markets or maybe some lower quality markets in India. So previously, most of the spices of Tanzania would stay locally or be supplied as a low quality spice to India, and the prime spices of India would go to Europe. But if you work with the farmers to increase the quality and you can better process it, if you get some organic certification and you can export as an aggregator yourself, there's a lot of margin increases that you can take as a company. And what our companies do that we have invested, they find ways to share this upside with the farmers. So in case of Trianon, they pay organic premiums, but most importantly, they pay quality premiums to the farmers. And that's where it links with Daniel's work. Through the work Daniel and Michelle and the teams on the ground, we see that the practices quickly result into a higher quality supply of ingredients to our companies. And the companies can then are also able to process that and access better markets. And that's when you create value and you compete with international markets. You have a system that works economically. So that is important across everything we do. So we invest in these agri-processors. That's a Ground investment company. With Ground Ingredients, we further try to bridge the gap between premium brands that want to source directly. Our Grounded Ventures are the IFC, like the IFC that Daniel is now the farm, is where we're the companies we've developed from scratch. And a Grounded Region Ag facility is actually a grant-based facility for high-risk R&D. So some finance trials where we try to support farmers with finance, where we do trials on the latest biostimulants, ingredients that we can make, do some testing, monitoring of soil sampling that is super expensive. So this is the different entities or different pillars of Grounded as a group and how they speak to one another. I don't want to go into this in too much depth now. But looking into Trianon, what these numbers mean, just to show you how it looks like on a company basis and how we've been able to find a model to invest in regenerative agriculture. Maybe as a note, in Europe, you might find investment models that are super interesting, where you buy conventional farms, you make them regenerative, improve them, increase their value, and then you sell the farm again. In Africa, that's for several reasons a model that is often not applicable or possible. And we've started to invest into these companies, the aggregators, the companies that buy from farmers. So back to Trianon, the company I've just mentioned. We saw that by investing in the farmers and investing in the processing facility actually the processing margin, so the gross profit margins of these companies, the differences in between what you buy the produce for with some processing loss and what you sell it for, that increased from 0 to 2% up to 18% in 2 years. The first 2 years, the sales of that 3&On company stayed stable, but this year they increased for €500,000 in revenue to over €1 million. So we see there's a lot of opportunities with these businesses once they have everything in place. Think about food safety certification, organic certification, but also know exactly can deliver on the specifications that European client wants. So that goes much further than just the certifications. Then there actually is a strong demand for this product. And secondly, we increase the scale of farmers 3&On source from. So the amount of farmers 3&On source from has remained stable. They're just buying more from existing farmers, and in particular, they're buying more from the farmers that they work with. So they started with almost 200 farmers organically certified, and currently that program is extended to 400 or 500 farmers. And I think what is important, what is very important to keep in mind is also the depth of impact. If you can look at the graph here, it just shows that the input cost, in our case, in Tanzania, we expect the input cost of farmers to go down, and that's what we're seeing over time. The other costs, the labor costs mainly remain stable. Farmers have to harvest, but what we see is that the income of farmers and what they net out after a year of work significantly increases. So we are not just about, and if you compare that to other programs, that is often we talk about a 25 to 50% increase in farm income at best. And then these farmers have a lower starting point. So the increased revenue or profits to these farmers is more. We are looking into ways, when we look at the continent as a whole, but especially the areas we invest in, we look at areas that have high opportunity and farmers with strong opportunity, and we invest in those opportunities, and that gives you different perspectives, but also allows for a much deeper impact and much more upside for both these businesses and these farmers. And I think that is something, if you look from an investment lens long term, that is something how we distinguishing ourselves from other things that are happening, other programs that are running. And for us, it's not just about scale, but also depth of impact, because in the end, the depth of impact allows us to make an investable case for both farmers and these processing companies and the investors that support us. So we want to make sure that whatever we do and all the regenerative agriculture we promote and the systems we set up, they are embedded in a strong economic rationale. So for the coming years as Grounded, in 2030, we want to work with source from 35,000 farmers that we source from, create an additional €40 million of annual revenue that will be actually result into 20 and more closely actually to €30 million in annual procurement from these farmers, put 50,000 hectares under regenerative practices. And we're currently raising a €40 million for our Evergreen Fund, of which we in particular look for €10 million in catalytic capital, that is grants or first loss, to unlock another €30 million in investment capital. So that can go in different tranches. That is not something that we would need tomorrow, but this is the target for the coming 3 years to reach these targets in 2030. Maybe one interesting comment to make, if you look at the families, on the bottom we say we want to benefit an additional 250,000 farmers. Our demand-driven approach, because we increase demand and take out more supply of the market, we actually see in many areas there's only 1 or 2 other buyers active. So by investing in these alternative aggregators, we create much more demand. And even if we take out 5 or 10% of the supply of a total region, we see prices increase with 10 to 20% for all farmers in that region, which are often, so if we buy from 5 to 10% of the farmers in a region, that benefits a factor 10 to 20 times the amount of farmers, which is a very strange dynamic, but especially in the coffee industry, you see that the coffee buyers have split up the different regions where they source from. So if there's four coffee companies sourcing in a certain country, they've split up where they source into 4 different areas. Now that is a story for another time, and we will dive into that another time, but that is an interesting dynamic, and it shows why a demand-driven model can have a bigger impact than a supply-driven model, something I'm passionate about, as you might have noticed. So back to summarize. I don't know if Daniel needs to summarize, because it's mostly his talking and his presentation. So Daniel, I'll leave the summarizer to you, and then you can start with some first questions.
Thanks, Gijs. So just in total, we work with a huge group of very diverse farmers across Africa. It's almost unfair to call it an African smallholder farmer. Each and every one of them are very unique with unique challenges, but there's one common thread that we've seen is that the regenerative practices that we're bringing are working for these farmers. These practices are knowledge-based, so they are easy to adopt, and because they don't depend on expensive inputs or that farmers need to take loans for, or any kind of specialized equipment. And yeah, as Gijs explained, the Regen program is just one half of the coin. Farmers need markets. Farmers need to be able to sell their products to make a better living. So it's critically important to approach this from a holistic standpoint, to not just do a farmer-focused program, but then the farmers are producing a whole lot more, and then they've still got nowhere to sell it. So Grounded's approach is unique in that we do take a very holistic view of this to create regenerative business cases, rather than just promoting a certain set of practices. Thank you very much. Yeah, we can jump to some questions. I see there are a few in the chats here already.
Yeah, Daniel, maybe first good to mention I see a question from Greg on the data, where you mentioned that on that first slide, it looks like yields are lower compared to conventional. But then a later slide, it says that the benefits of Regen Ag are higher yield. I actually think that is because on that first slide, we compared a smallholder farming setup in Zambia with actually a large-scale, basically industrial conventional farmer. So that is somebody who usually will have large amount of crops under a center pivot, which is not what the starting position would be for a smallholder farmer. So that am I right, Daniel?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Most smallholder farmers that we work with, when we arrive, they're producing at about 20% of the commercial yield potential, if you want to call it that. So they're starting at a very low level. So any intervention helps them rapidly increase their yields. But that first comparison was against a proper full-scale commercial farmer, just to show that these small-scale farmers doing a regenerative practices can actually compete with the conventional farmers. There's often a big criticism is that conventional farming is so much more efficient, but it's not been the case as far as we could see, is that on a gross profitability scale, small-scale farmers doing the right techniques can easily match what a conventional farmer is doing, although there is a yield disparity, but the cost disparity is important to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, so if you compare it to a small-scale farmer before practicing regenerative agriculture, then the yield will go up if he or she starts doing regenerative agriculture. But then if you compare it to somebody who has a huge, more industrial farm, then it is maybe slightly lower still, but the profitability is the same. That is what we found.
Exactly.
And then I'm going to go to a next question on whether we've tried looking at this in urban contexts. I don't know, Daniel or Gijs, if one of you wants to say something about this.
From my perspective, the types of operating companies that we're investing in are usually more rural settings. So it's just because of where we work, we found we work in much more rural areas where farmers produce a single cash crop that's exportable. So either dried spice, like dried cinnamon or pepper, or chilies. The one model that we are working on is this incubator farm model, where we hope to increase the efficiency of farmers. So by aggregating farmers together, like what we're doing here in Zambia, we've got a model where we create an incubator farm where several different small-scale farmers can get together. They have access to water in terms of irrigation and a single tractor. And what we found here at the experimental farm is that we aggregate farmers onto a smaller piece of land, give them the right kind of infrastructure, a high amount of training, then these farmers can achieve almost 10 times the value or the income compared to a farmer, a small-scale farmer that's just on their own. So that's the closest that we get to urban context. And we sort of envision that these incubator farms in the future, once we've perfected the model, that we would set up incubator farms like these on the edges of urban centers, because there's a rapid growth in Africa's population. It's, I think, projected to double by 2050 or something like that. It's growing very rapidly, and there's a huge amount of urbanization. So people moving away from the rural areas into the cities. So very soon there's going to be a big problem for African cities to be able to bring in or import enough food. And that's why we're developing these incubator farm models where we can work in the peri-urban environment most possibly.
Yeah, maybe to add on the urban farming, I think it's super interesting. In what I've seen in general is just high level, because the situations differs everywhere. But for example, herbs, fresh herbs, lettuce are products that have a high quality if they're freshly harvested. And you see that in many urban areas, it might sometimes make economic sense to give a certain quality if you produce that very close to where you need the product. Generally, vegetables with a bit longer shelf life, it doesn't outweigh the costs, don't outweigh the benefits. Then if you harvest once every so many days and you do that outside of town within a 100 to 200 kilometers radius from a city. And obviously for the other crops, so the high value non-perishable crops, that's so coffee or spices, that is a completely different dynamic. So there's different models, but we don't really focus on the urban farming.
Thanks. I am just going to explain or answer a question of Sarah Whaley on our funds or funding model and where we found investors and whether we work with any carbon funds or biodiversity credits. Yeah, so currently we have, in the beginning, we've had quite a lot of subsidies and donor funds when we were building our own ventures. And right now we are raising investments into our investment fund, which are mostly family offices. And then we actually have Doen participations in the Netherlands also as an anchor investor. We're also talking to some more institutional investors. We have so far not yet been able to implement carbon mechanisms effectively, and that is because most of the time the monitoring costs have been too high to actually make it worthwhile for these farmers, because farmers are usually in very remote locations, so it's quite costly to go and monitor the actual effects. So, but if anyone knows of ways to do this effectively, then we're very open to it. We have been looking at this market in the past 8 years, but have never been able to make it work. And then I'm going to talk about, I think Lindsay asked a question that this works well with coffee, but whether there's also any regen ag work happening with tea. Yes. Actually, we have set up our own is a herbal tea company called the Honeybush Company in South Africa, where we do wild harvesting and regenerative cultivation. It's an indigenous crop similar to rooibos. We're actually also through Grounded Ingredients doing quite a lot of work on regenerative rooibos. They've worked on the world's first regeneratively produced rooibos, which is also carbon neutral and or carbon positive, I believe even. And we are actually exploring opportunities in tea in Kenya as well. So Camellia sinensis black tea and green. So yeah, we're working on that. And then
You're welcome.
Sorry, Gijs?
Feel free to share opportunities if you have these type of business or aggregators in tea.
Yes, exactly.
We have a lot of clients in tea that are interested in this, but we're still looking for the right partner. That's something that we're very curious into to see if there's opportunities that you see in Kenya, Rwanda, potentially Malawi. Any opportunities for these type of businesses? Don't hesitate to share.
And then I see a good question from Joshua. What are the trade-offs of regenerative agriculture in terms of labor allocation at the household level, and how does it impact the current gender dynamics? Daniel, is it something you can say something about? Do you have any?
Yes. So it is a complicated issue in terms of household labor. We try to promote farmers to not use their own family labor as where we can have an influence on this. Often children will help with picking in certain instances when there's peak season times. We do have a monitoring program in place where we try and survey the farmers and check where the children are going to school. So that's one of the things that we are cautious about managing. Then the other part of it is in terms of gender dynamics. We do try and promote programs where it promotes gender equality. So, for instance, in Uganda, there's we pay a woman's premium for the coffee pickers. So female farmers who deliver coffee, they get a 20% premium price. It's driven by our market, so we've got a very nice customer that's buying our coffee, and they have very high ambitions for the impact. So there's a woman's premium that we then pay to these ladies in Uganda. What we've found is, even if the household is, usually the men and the women do the same amount of work, but then the men would be the registered farmer and they would bring the crop to be delivered and they would receive the cash. And I think the statistic was, if the woman receives the cash, she's 7 times more likely to spend it on the household than to spend all of it on the household compared to the man receiving the cash. So we try and make mechanisms like this woman's premium, because then often the man gives the woman the coffee to go and deliver to the micro station to get the premium, and then she's more likely to spend that money on her home. In general, the regen practices, the farmers that we work with, it's not more labor intensive to follow the regen practices. In most cases, it's less labor intensive because we promote minimum tillage practices, and tillage and weeding are the 2 most labor intensive practices in most of the systems that we're working with. So often the labor becomes less, and through various mechanisms, we try and favor women farmers to be the recipients of the cash that gets paid out for the materials. So I don't know if that answers the question nicely, Joshua.
Great, thanks, Daniel. I'm gonna also ask you the question of Kozo. Sorry, I probably didn't pronounce your name exactly right. On actually a good question on some of the regenerative practices that we implemented, like bioliquid fertilizers, cover crops, green manure, whatever, compost production. in the trials, did we study the effects of these individual practices or only of all the practices combined?
So the monitoring, so at the IFC farm itself, we do specific crop trials. So we've trialed, let's say, just cover crops, and we test the soil before and after to see what the residual nutrients are left if you work the cover crops into the soil. So we've done those sort of specific trials at the IFC farm in Zambia. It's not easy to do this with the small scale farmers at the other operating companies. So what we do set up is a longer term, we're setting up a long-term soil health monitoring plan. And because we work with these lead farmers, these we call them champion farmers, we monitor their soil health and do a survey with them to see what practices they're implementing against a control farmer in the same village, so in a similar region with similar climate and so on. And then we try and compare the two together. But in those contexts, it's very difficult to isolate what exactly is having the benefit. Often we see that the farmers identify this themselves. So they'll do practices where the they sort of do their own cost benefit analysis. So when they see the cover crops are working well, but the bringing animals into the field doesn't work so well in their system, they'll prefer to use the cover crops. So naturally they tend to refine their own systems then in time. So that's sort of the approach that we take. Where we can, we trial, but in most cases it's an all-in kind of approach.
Thanks, Daniel. And then I see a question from Hannes. I think Gijs can actually answer that one. I love Grounded's work. Thank you, Hannes. How do you plan to deal with price fluctuations on international markets?
Yeah, this is a super challenging question and one of the biggest, I think, challenges for farmers. Most of the price fluctuations worldwide end up with either consumers or farmers. We are not 100% mitigating all of that. So we still the farmers that we work with are still exposed, in many cases, still exposed to international market prices, demands, oversupply. And not all our companies have the power to buy at a minimum floor price when market prices are very low. So they don't have the capacity to operate at a loss. That does change if some of the buyers are committed to buy a certain price. So, for example, with the coffee company, we have buyers that guarantee a certain price up front. And there's longer term contracts, so that does allow for a minimum price. However, the challenge of some of these contracts, if a coffee company or a tree and on the spice company has done and does no longer term contracts, and market prices go up a lot, farmers could earn much more in another place. So we basically have to pay, we would have to buy at a discount, or we have to make a loss as well, because the prices of the products that the companies are buying are higher than what they can sell it for. So there's a lot of difficult dynamics there. The best that these companies can do is have long-term relationships with the buyers, make sure there's premium being paid over whatever the current prices are, and we try to work on certain floor prices to get the worst situations out. In reality, it's challenging, and the companies are only partially able to take away of those risks. They're super systematic, so and super deeply entrenched in our current system. So it's not something that we are easily solving, and that we're definitely not solving that to the extent that we would want to do that.
Thanks, Gijs. Okay, then one last question. I think Daniel can speak to this very well. Question from Nick. In your experience, what are the key challenges faced by smallholder farmers in South Africa versus other sub-Saharan African countries?
Thanks, Nick. To be honest, we don't have so much experience in South Africa. We had worked with smaller commercial farmers in South Africa in the Baviaans Kloof and the Essential Oil Project. And the honeybush companies primarily focused on sustainable wild harvesting of honeybush with very little farming. Just from being a South African and knowing what I know, land security, land tenure is a very difficult issue for a lot of small-scale farmers, and also a little bit the farmer's attitude. In South Africa, there's this mentality that the farmer needs to be helped by the government or by someone to be able to produce. And what I've seen with in the other African countries, the farmers are really self-driven. If they don't plant and they don't produce the food, their family dies of starvation. So they are highly motivated to farm and farm successfully, and there aren't a lot of subsidy programs out there. Sure, when they are available, then they do help these farmers, but it is very much an attitude thing with the farmers that we work with, for instance, in East Africa or even here in Zambia, is that the farmers are very strongly self-motivated to make a success of their farms. And then with a very little bit of help, they can really achieve a lot. Where South African farmers, small-scale farmers, sometimes lack that kind of attitude. Yeah, so sometimes your mentality also just has to be right as a farmer to be able to receive effectively when you're given a little bit of a helping hand. So yeah, that's more of a political thing. So I don't know if that helps.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and then we are, I think, right on time. So thanks everybody for joining. We will, if we can figure it out IT-wise, we will share the recording of this webinar with everybody. And I also saw a question on whether it's possible to access the reports from the trials we conducted. Yeah, we can actually try to produce those in a format that they are also shareable. We're also drafting something like a white paper, which I don't know when it will be ready. I'm not making any promises, but oh, sorry. Yes, Claire, I see we skipped a question. We will get in touch with you. I'm sorry, there were so many questions. Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.